Great Power, Chapter 7, Making a Move. Sam had to admit they looked quite snazzy in their brand new Asgardian outfits. Luke's was a yellowy gold with black and silver accents and black trousers. Danny's was green with gold accents and darker green trousers. Sam's own outfit was a deep royal blue with bright gold accents. The girls had yet to reappear. But Sam couldn't wait to tease them. Neither girl really liked wearing actual dresses. Piper, in particular, had admitted that she found dresses and skirts a hassle, not only to fight in, but wall crawling was made highly uncomfortable in a dress. He had no doubt that she could kick someone's ass in 5-inch stilettos. She'd been trained by the Black Widow, after all, but it would be the first time he'd seen her in a dress. The doors to the Great Hall opened, and the announcer spoke loudly over the din of the already ongoing feast. "Presenting Lady Sif, Lady Ava, and Lady Piper." Sam's head shot up from the goblet in his hands. He spotted Ava first, and had to admit, she looked pretty spectacular. Her dress looked like it had been at least partially based around her costume. The flowing white material and green gems echoing the white and jade medallion at her neck. Lady Sif was dressed in something similar to what she'd been wearing when she'd been frozen in the block of ice, just a lighter red with a longer skirt. Then he spotted Piper, and his goblet nearly fell out of his hands. He had to scramble to catch it. Luke snorted at him, and Danny nodded to the girls. Sam had stopped paying attention to the other boys, though. Instead, his eyes were glued to Piper. Her hair was falling loose as usual, a silver circlet nestled in brown locks. Her eyes were still that shining blue, but she seemed to be wearing the Asgardian equivalent to makeup, something she never did, and it made her eyes seem so much more intense than they had been before. The dress she wore was a floor-length blood-red affair with silver accents at the base of the skirt. She wore a silver plate mail corset that glittered in the light, offsetting the sleeves of the dress, which were short but tasteful. It occurred to Sam, then, that he'd never seen her in short sleeves before, probably because she was almost always wearing her costume under her clothes. And it was hard to roll up sleeves that tight. But seeing her now, he realized that she had far more muscle definition in her arms than he'd ever imagined. She was talking, using her hands to emphasize what she was saying like she always did. Luke was holding back laughter as Danny leaned over to Sam, holding out a napkin. "You're drooling." Sam snatched the napkin from his friend as Danny joined Luke in his laughter. Piper and Ava were making their way over to them. Sam scrubbed his mouth, not willing to risk embarrassing himself. Piper grinned and sat down next to him. "I gotta say, Asgardians sure know how to party," she said. She had to raise her voice to be heard. Sam nodded as Thor, at the head of the table close by them, banged his goblet on the table to call for silence and raised his drink high. "To the warriors of Midgard!" The whole room filled with cheers, and the party began in earnest. Food was passed around, and stories of the battle were told and retold again and again. About an hour later, Sam noticed Piper slip away from the crowd out onto the balcony. He followed her. Missing Luke and Ava shooting him the thumbs up, Danny just shook his head and went back to speaking with Hogan about his home with the Vanir. Piper leaned on the railing, looking up into the blue sky. Despite its brightness, she could still make out stars beyond it, just slightly brighter points of light in the blue. Her eyes wandered over the sky, trying to find out familiar constellations. Someone stepped up next to her and leaned on the railing. "What are you doing, webhead?" Piper grinned slightly, glancing over at Sam. "Looking for home." Sam raised an eyebrow. Piper laughed and leaned a bit more heavily on the railing. "Ever since I got my powers, I've had fantastic vision. On clear nights on Earth, I don't need a telescope to see some stars so clearly. It's kind of a big deal for me, because I used to wear the worst inch-thick glasses." Sam chuckled. "I bet you looked adorable." Piper laughed. "I looked like a dork. Ask anyone." Sam shook his head. "But dork is kind of your thing, and you wear it better than anyone I've ever met." Piper blushed red and looked back up. There was a slight frown on her face. "I don't recognize any of these constellations." Sam shaded his eyes and managed to make out the glimmer of what Piper could probably see so much better. He smiled. "I do." Piper raised her eyebrows. "I didn't know you were into space stuff." Sam grinned wide. Ever since I was little, my dad used to take me out into the desert, and sometimes we'd bring my little sister, too. We'd spend the whole night stargazing. Piper grinned softly. Which desert? Sam smiled wide. The Sonoran. He used to tell me stories about how he was a member of an intergalactic police force, the Nova Corps. Everyone said he was a crazy drunk, but they were wrong. Sam fiddled with the buttons on his vest. Piper reached out to him. What happened to him? Sam's frown deepened. To this day, I don't know. He went missing about 2 years ago. I found his helmet after he went missing. When I tried it on, I got these amazing powers, and then I passed out. Piper chuckled. Sam glared at her, but saw a glint of nostalgia in her eyes. Things like that do tend to make one pass out. DNA altering isn't generally something the human body can take awake. Sam grinned slightly. She sounded like she spoke from experience. He nodded. But then I woke up on a spaceship. Piper's eyebrows shot up. Really? Sam nodded, glad for once that he'd managed to surprise her. Yep. Piper laughed. I don't know if I would have believed anything was real after that if it were me. Sam nodded. It occurred to me, but they talked about my dad. I had to see if there was anything to it. Piper nodded. They were quiet for a moment. Besides, even if it wasn't real, I could never dream up anyone like you. Piper laughed loudly. How so? Sam blushed slightly. He hadn't really meant to say that out loud, but there was no going back now. He had to take the plunge. Well, you're unpredictable, brilliant, cunning, occasionally terrifying, kind, helpful, and selfless, not to mention pretty. Sam didn't look up for a moment. He was terrified she was going to laugh at him. When she didn't, he looked up into her face. She was bright red, nearly the same color as her costume. Her eyes were shining slightly. You really think all that about me? Sam nodded. I do. I think you're pretty amazing, Spidey. She grinned at him, her blush not fading. Slowly, he reached out to where her hand lay on the railing and set his on hers. She turned her hand in his and squeezed gently. I think you're pretty spectacular yourself. Sam leaned in slightly. Piper followed suit moments later, but before they could get any closer, a booming voice called from the doorway to the balcony. I believe it is time we returned you to Midgard. Thor was standing there, Luke, Ava, and Danny behind him. Luke and Ava were looking at Thor like he'd just crushed all their dreams, and Danny was shaking his head. Piper nodded. Keeping Sam's hand in hers, she led him off after the others. Chapter 8. Coming Home. Their bags had been collected from where they'd left them in the snow near the gates what felt like days ago. Their costumes had been washed, and Nova's helmet polished. Their bags were slightly heavier than before. Thor had seen fit to reward each of them with a piece of Asgard to remind them of their short time there. The others were handed back their weapons, looking a bit starstruck as they were led out of the city on horseback to thunderous applause. Piper grinned as she spotted a mother holding her child so she could see the warriors of Midgard. She waved at the little girl, who laughed loudly and waved back. Soon enough, they were on the Rainbow Bridge out of the city. Piper couldn't help but stare at it. A bridge of pure cosmic energy was how Jane Foster had described it. Piper couldn't help but agree. But all too soon they were dismounting their horses at the edge of Asgard itself. Piper dismounted with ease and laughed as she caught Sam, who'd tried to flail his way off his horse and managed to get his foot caught in the stirrup. He looked up at her, his face bright red, and shook his head. Is there anything you can't do, Webbs? Piper set him back on his feet and seemed to think for a second. Knit. Sam laughed and tentatively reached out for her hand. She took his, and the others followed them into the large golden dome. Thor was already inside, speaking to a man dressed in gold armor. They glanced over at Sam. Thor looked like he was still deciding if he liked the kid or not. But a pointed look from Piper put his smile back on his face. He walked over to the small group of teens and gestured them forward. Come, it is time we return to Midgard. Piper's hand tightened on Sam's. He raised an eyebrow at her. She smiled sheepishly. My dad's gonna freak. Sam laughed. They were all still in their Asgardian outfits. Danny had his sword strapped to his hip. Luke and Sam had their axe and halberd strapped to their backs. Ava's bow rested crossways across her back. Piper was still wearing the cuffs around her wrists. They stepped over to the edge of the dome as Heimdall stepped behind them and placed his sword into the ground. The opening in the dome that led out into empty space lit up in bright rainbow colors. Piper grinned and followed Thor into the light, dragging Sam with her. It had been 6 days. 6 long days since Thor had killed a frost giant at the Smithsonian. 6 days since the Thunderer had disappeared, taking 5 innocent school children with him. Tony Stark beat his head against his console. He hadn't moved since his discussion with Bruce 3 days ago. He'd been combing every avenue he could think of to find his daughter. Nothing had worked, but he couldn't give up. Giving up meant accepting that she was gone, accepting that she was never coming back, that he'd lost one of the 2 things he couldn't live without. Pepper had buried herself under her work to deal with everything she was feeling. He hadn't slept in days. Jarvis kept reminding him that she wouldn't want him to be like this, but he couldn't stop now. He turned to the star map he'd been working on with Jane Foster. If they'd ended up on Asgard, as Jane once had, then there had to be a way to get there. Jarvis was machining one of the Quinjets to be space-worthy as Tony stared blankly at his map. A bright light caught Tony's eyes and he groaned, then checked his watch. It was just past midnight. The sun shouldn't be rising yet. Then every alarm in the lab went off. It wasn't sunlight, but the light of the Bifrost. Tony leapt out of his chair and limped to the window. A few floors down, on the balcony of the family level, a burned ring of runes had appeared under a group of 6 people. Tony ignored his aches and ran out of his lab past a confused-looking Bruce who was holding a blanket. Piper blinked her eyes, taking a moment to adjust to the darkness around her. She frowned. It had been around midday on Asgard. For the first time, it occurred to her that time on Thor's world might not work the same way it did here on Earth. She had no doubt that they were back on Earth. She'd know that view anywhere. This was a view you could only get from the balcony outside Avengers Tower. New York sprawling out in front of her like a billion stars in the night. She grinned and was about to turn to Sam when the door to the family level burst open and Tony Stark came barreling out of the doors. He looked like shit, and she was being generous. He had bags under his eyes like she hadn't seen since right after New York. He paused in the doorway looking at them and wobbled. Piper dropped Sam's hand and raced over to her dad. He wrapped his arms around her and shook for a moment. She murmured assurances, and he nodded. It took him a bit to pull himself together, but when he managed it, he glared over Piper's shoulder at Thor. He hugged his daughter for another moment before he let go and teetered his way over to Thor. The teens made room for him, all staring as the engineer spoke. "If I didn't think I'd break my hand, I'd punch you in your perfect teeth." The teens all glanced at each other. Piper looked the most confused. Her dad hadn't been drinking. She'd have smelled alcohol on him if he had been. But he kept talking. 6 days. I have been worried sick. We've all been worried sick for 6 days. 144 hours. 8,640 minutes. What is the point of communicators that work through space if you don't use them? Piper stared at her dad. "Dad, what are you talking about? We've been gone maybe 12 hours. Tony froze. He turned between Piper and the other teens, all of whom nodded, looking beyond confused. Then Piper's face lit up with understanding. "There's a time differential." She bounced over to her dad. "There's a time differential between Earth and Asgard. If we're right, and we've been on Asgard for 12 hours in their time and 6 days here, then that means that every 3 or so hours on Asgard is a day on Earth." Piper grabbed Luke's arm and rolled up his sleeve to get at the watch she was still wearing. It was a digital watch, and the numbers had sped up and were flashing by, the watch apparently catching up with time around them. Piper grabbed Tony's arm, and they grinned at each other. They made to race off, but Captain America caught Tony by the back of his shirt and Piper by the back of her plate mail. "Not so fast, you two. Tony is having a shower before you go all scientific on this, and you and your friends are going to go to medical and make sure everything's all right." Tony and Piper had twin pouts on their faces as they looked up at Steve, but his frown brooked no arguments as he looked at them. Tony rolled his eyes and Piper stepped behind him slightly. Steve shook his head. "The whole city saw that light show. Piper, and Pepper and Nat are dealing with the press. Bruce and Clint are heading off to Fury. I'm making breakfast. You lot get cleaned up, leave your weapons in the armory, and we'll talk about what happened. Thor nodded. Verily, I believe the captain is correct. We should break fast together and speak on the events that occurred. Thor knew that Piper would web-slap him into next Thursday if her father ever found out that she was Spidey from him, so he stopped himself just short of retelling the whole tale. Instead, he let the captain lead him into the kitchen with Piper, while Piper took the others to the medical level and Tony went off to take a shower. The news was in a frenzy. The missing teens from Midtown High were back, alive and adorned in Asgardian fashion. They had each given a statement to S.H.I.E.L.D., who were, of course, trying to keep a tight lid on everything, but some brave photographer by the name of Eddie Brock had snuck several pictures of all 5 teens decked out in full Asgardian gear. They looked like they had just stepped out of a Dungeons & Dragons handbook. Norman Osborn chuckled down at the article on his tablet. He was glad that Piper was alive. She was a sweet girl, and if he would ever make a move, one of the best things that Harry could ever acquire in his life. She would be an asset to the family if Harry ever got his head out of his ass. But he had more pressing concerns on his plate right now. He'd finally managed to acquire a sample of the webbing that had been left at the scenes of several brutal beatings. Jameson was claiming the beatings were Spider-Girl's doing, but that didn't sit right with him. Spider-Girl was a lot of things, but he couldn't see her breaking both of Batrock's legs. It didn't fit her MO. And then there was the fact that every victim babbled about a black hulking figure. Maybe Venom wasn't as gone as S.H.I.E.L.D. had said. He glanced down at his phone and frowned. Harry still hadn't called him back. He needed to find his son and fast before he did anything that could tarnish his illustrious name.